Okay, today we are lucky that Victor Malarek is so generous that he's willing to spend time with us on Zoom. Victor Malarek is an accomplished investigative journalist in Canada and an accomplished interviewer. In his long career in journalism, Victor Malarek has worked for the Montreal Star, the Globe and Mail, W5, and the Fifth Estate. He has won 4 Michener Awards, which are Canada's version of the Americans' Pulitzer Prize for journalism, and he's won a Gemini Award as Canada's top journalist. All that after starting at the Montreal Star as a police reporter in August 1970, when he was about 22 years old, a few months before the national crisis that led to martial law in Canada. That crisis started in Quebec, where Malarek was a new reporter. It was called the October Crisis, 2 months after Malarek had been hired in August. It started with the kidnapping of 2 public officials by a Quebec nationalist terrorist group. One of those kidnapped was executed by the terrorists. Malarek was one of the reporters chasing leads where the hostages might be hidden, including the one who was killed. The threat was very real. Malarek was there, 22 years old, a new reporter. In his career, Malarek has exposed corruption, injustice, human cruelty, and suffering. In one investigation, he revealed that the RCMP spent $1 million to incite Canadian Elaine Olivier to commit the crime of drug trafficking in Thailand, where Olivier was sentenced to life in prison in Thailand. He spent 8.5 years in prison in Thailand, and then was returned to Canada on an extradition treaty and released a few months later. Olivier was paid and threatened by RCMP undercover officers to commit the crime that they wanted to convict him of, because then they would get credit for a supposed big drug bust. For the purposes of this course on interviewing, we're interested in learning from Victor Malarek about his experience as an interviewer. What is his personal style as an interviewer? What types of questions does he ask? What types of questions has he learned work best and learned that work least? In class, we've examined Victor Malarek's 1993 interview of Ernst Zundel, the neo-Nazi publisher, 1993. And Malarek got some amazing admissions from Zundel without apparently being sued for libel. Zundel later was sentenced to prison. In March 2005, Zundel was deported from Canada to Germany. Arriving in Germany, Zundel was immediately arrested at the airport, detained in prison, awaiting trial for inciting racist hatred. In February 2007, Zundel was convicted and sentenced in Germany to the maximum term of 5 years in prison for inciting hatred against an identifiable group. In March 2010, Zundel was released. But think back, in 1993, when Malarek interviewed Zundel in Canada, that hadn't happened yet. The year before, in 1992, Zundel's prior conviction in Canada for reporting false news was overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada when the law under which Zundel had been charged and convicted was ruled unconstitutional. So in 1993, Zundel might have felt bolder, or he might have felt that he needed to be careful what he said. Maybe Malarek can tell us about the mood of Zundel and psychology of Zundel's reactions to the questions and all the things that went on that you don't see when you're seeing the broadcast. And probably Victor Malarek needed to be careful too, not to expose himself to a lawsuit from Zundel. So in the 1993 interview, Zundel told Malarek that he was, quote, the guru of the right. And when asked by Malarek the question, he's your hero, and your hero is comparing Jews to monkeys, Zundel made the remarkable comment, well, that's Adolf Hitler. Remember, nobody's perfect. That clip was used at the end of the broadcast. And remember that this in this type of broadcast, the sequence of the questions and answers can be edited. In that broadcast, Malarek asked Zundel, some of your most vociferous critics have said that you planted the seeds of hate, and now the harvest is being reaped. Zundel answered, I have acted within the Constitution of this country, that's Canada. I also have the right to export these ideas to Germany. I am a gift to this world. The broadcast at that moment goes to a close-up of Zundel smiling as he said that. Zundel says, and this is the final line in the broadcast, it ends with the words of Zundel without commentary. And Zundel says, if people don't want to agree with it or not, I frankly don't give a damn. So how was Malarek able to get these admissions from Zundel? How did Malarek plan that interview and plan other interviews? What kind of psychology does Malarek use in interviewing someone like Zundel and others? So please welcome Victor Malarek.
Hi. That interview and so many interviews that I've done in the past where I'm going into a situation that is antagonistic, or it could be one where you're going to get accountability or you know it's going to be tough. I'm going into a situation with neo-Nazis, with people that are abhorrent to me, and you have to watch yourself about your own personal way. You know, I don't like these people. I've never liked these people, but I cannot be seen as being strident. I cannot be seen as anything but an objective journalist listening to these people, but knowing when to come in, when to come out, the kind of questions to ask. But the number one thing that I always begin with before I even start interviewing is to make certain that I do a hell of a lot of research on these characters, the characters I interviewed in Germany and Ernst Zundel himself, to know who he is, what I think his weak points are. And to me, I knew one of his weak points were his ego. And his ego would trip up and get him into trouble. It's just, how do you get him to say the kinds of things that you want the public to really see what this character is all about? Because many people that I've interviewed, they play a game. They realize that they're on camera or for a newspaper, and they're going to play politics with you. You see politicians do it all the time. I would be talking to a politician in an interview, and off camera, he's a completely different kettle of fish. Zundel was going to be the same way, except I have a tendency to, once I know what the character is in front of me and what crime they may have committed or what involvement they may have been involved in some crazy thing that I'm investigating, I try to understand where I'm going to take this interview and what I want from this person and what I want the public to understand what this person's all about. This comes about by researching and knowing your subject matter, the kinds of things that he said, the kinds of things that his followers have done, and how he might respond. and giving him that opportunity to respond, but also knowing from my research that I can always come back and say, wait a second, you know, so many people have been killed, so many people have been beaten by by your organization, by these neo-Nazis. You go, yeah, who told you that? The Jews and idiot reporters? No. This comes from the government of Germany. And then his response was, well, they're nothing but quislings. But it gets people to understand what this character is all about. Every story that I ever go into, before I know that I have a major interview to do, whether it was for the newspapers or whether it was for the Fifth Estate or W5, was that I had to make certain that I had all of the research in here on my notes so that I know when to come in, when to go out. But I want that person to talk. I want them to dig the hole for themselves or to express themselves whichever way they want so the public can see that it's not about me. Let me hear you say what you've got to say. A lot of times when I've interviewed really bad guys, I really do want to get them because I want the public to see that what kind of scam they're involved in, what kind of abuses they've been involved in, what kind of nastiness they're into. And let the public make a decision on their own without me having to say, you're just a jerk. I mean, I've actually done that too. I mean, I did an interview with the head of the Toronto police union once, and I began the interview by saying, a lot of people look at you as a thug and, a thug and a bully. And I could see my producer from the side going, this is a way to start an interview? That was exactly how I said. A lot of people look at you as a thug and a bully. What's your response? And then he went at it. And the interview between him and I just was going back and forth and back and forth. With a character like Zundel, I knew he was going to do whatever he was going to do. He was going to try to play it so that he can get as much television time as he wants. The bottom line is, though, he put his foot so many times in his mouth that the Canadian public and anyone else who had seen it in the United States or elsewhere would know exactly what this egomaniac was all about. And that's what he is and was, an egomaniac who thought that he's a gift to Canada or a gift to the world. What he is a joke. But a lot of people follow this joke. All you have to do is look in south of the border to see how many people followed, the former joke there that was president of the United States. This guy, you look at the things he says and what he says, which are so abusive and racist and inflammatory, and yet he's got a massive following. But the journalist who interviewed him repeatedly, knew what they were going to get, and it's how to keep on track and not let this guy continually harp and bring the same mantra to the table so that the public seeing this guy but nobody taking him on. I think in a good interview, you have to plan. And that is the main thing for anybody. If you're going to do an interview and you're not planned, and I've seen this many times, even now on the Fifth Estate or W5 or in the Globe and Mail or the National Post or whatever, you look at the interview, you can see the way it's written or the way it's broadcast that the person who was doing the interviewing or broadcast didn't know or didn't have the right tools, which is the research in place and the knowledge of that research, ready to take on any lie, any exaggeration, anything that needed to be taken on, any fake piece of information that would be thrown out, to be able to come back and say, wait a second, you're saying this, but that's not true because the facts show what's happening here. So you've always got to be on your guard, and you can't be on your guard if your research isn't good, and if you haven't taken that research and put it into your mind and put it into your notes to say, when I'm interviewing this person, this is what I want to do. And in many times, when I was with the Fifth Estate, they used to call me part of the gotcha gang. Got him. Because you wait for that moment when you're doing an important interview and you really want to show what is going on, especially when it's something that is injurious to people that are being hurt by this character or being used by these characters. You've got to be able to get them, and you get them by asking the toughest questions, normally towards the end, to to show that everything that they've done at the end of this interview is going to be is going to come out with a statement that this guy got him and we know what he's all about. Now, one of the things that I'm seeing today in interviewing, and I really don't understand how this has evolved, is these people who call themselves journalists who can't shut their mouths for 3 seconds to let someone answer a question, but before even asking a question, here's what they do. They'll ask 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 questions, all one after the other, bouncing one after the other after the other. Like, Pfizer has come out with this drug. Canada is supporting this, but it was supporting AstraZeneca. So where did AstraZeneca suddenly go down? And what's happening with the drug that we bought from AstraZeneca? And there's Moderna as well, because Moderna, when you look at the RNA and all the development of this, and by the way, how much is Canada really paying for this? And how much of the AstraZeneca did they give to other countries, poorer countries, so that they can use it? And you're sitting there going, why don't you just ask one freaking question? Because no matter who you ask the question, they will pick 1 or 2 that they know that they can answer very easily. And the rest of this garbage that spewed out of the journalist's mouth goes down the toilet. I don't understand why journalists have to sit there and say, look how smart I am. I know this, I know that. Yeah, because you've researched it. But you don't have to put your PhD, your master's degree, or your bachelor's degree, or whatever degree you have, or even if you don't have a degree, out there for people to see, listen to, and hear. I don't understand why journalism has gone that way. I had a habit, and still, if I was still doing this, to ask one question at a time to make certain I got that answer. Because that way there, you keep going one after the other, after the other, after the other, and the questions are answered. And if they're not, you can go back to that question. Wait a second, I asked you this. Because politicians have a mantra. You look at Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin. All he does is mantra it. And the journalists don't interfere, I don't know why not, to say, wait a second, Mr. Prime Minister, this is the question that I asked. Didn't get an answer. Why are you not answering this question? And then I'll repeat it. But they ask so many questions where the Prime Minister in the end just picks the one that he finds the easiest and goes, next question, and everything else is lost. There are so many very important issues out there that need to be investigated, that need to be done with solid, good interviews by good, solid reporters who know how to interview. And if they can't ask a proper, simple question, they'll never get a proper, simple answer, but they'll get a hell of a lot of obfuscation, a lot of confusion. And in the end, when you read the transcript or you see it and you say, geez, that has nothing to do with my question. Really? I know why. Because he didn't have to answer 6 questions or 3 questions, and he didn't have to respond to your so-called intelligence. I would assume that anybody who's a journalist working for a newspaper or for a television station or radio station would have a modicum of intelligence to ask tough questions and understand what the answers are. But today, I just shake my head. Sometimes I feel like throwing something through my television screen, watching some of the crazy antics that go on when all I want is ask this question so I can get an answer that is simple and go to the next question and ask it. Now, one of the things is, so many reporters will go into an interview and they'll have, a notepad loaded with questions, loaded with them. I have always had my notepad with me with questions and also when to go in with the information that I have that will take that person down or catch them lying. And, it's good to have that. But here's what I see now. They have that pad in front of them and they read the first question. And as the person is answering the question, they're like this. They're not paying attention. They're looking at their next question to make themselves sound really smart. And they miss a hell of a lot because the most important thing in an interview, the most important thing is listening. And that's what I always did. I listened to what they're saying, and then I could come back. I don't have to go back to my questions. I know what my questions are going to be. But it's what they're going to say that's going to put their foot in their mouth, or that's going to take your story or your investigation or whatever you're doing up a notch. Politicians have a habit of obfuscating. They very rarely give you the goods. But if you listen to what they're saying, you can always come back. With Zundel, I nailed him. But I would just sit back very calmly and listen to him, not get excited or upset or whatever. Just sit there and listen and know when to go in and know when to challenge. Know when to go and challenge and say, wait a second, you're saying this, but this is the case. And let him say whatever he wants and then go on to the next question. You have to listen. And today when I'm watching people, I realize they're not listening because they're thinking about their next question or how good they're going to look or sound or appear in a newspaper, on television, on radio. You have to listen. And in listening, that's when you come out with the really good punch, because you've already done your research, you know where you're going, and you know how to catch them. Zundel is, I knew this guy's an egotistical character. He's not something that was a challenge to me in any way, because I know if you play to a person's ego or you just sit back, you know he's going to stick his foot in his mouth 15 times to Sunday. He's got his followers and his twits, but at least Canada got to see what this character was all about. And, wherever else it played, they could also see what this person was all about or is all about. Many times, for example, I've done so many investigations where I wait for an opportunity. There was a guy who was accused of being a spy in the RCMP security service many years ago. His name was James Leslie Bennett. This guy was vilified and made out to be a KGB mole. His whole life was destroyed, absolutely destroyed, by the RCMP security service when they investigated him. He left Canada with a black shroud over his head. He basically self-exiled himself to Adelaide, Australia, a little town. And there he lived, lost his family. They left him, his daughters, everything. He was completely destroyed. And no one did anything from 1972 onwards. Everybody believed that this guy was a traitor. And one time I was talking with a very good contact of mine, and that's one of the things that I always tell journalists: get good contacts, work them, develop them. And this contact of mine was very high up in the RCMP, was retiring. And I asked him, I said, is there any investigation you ever did that just pisses you off or depresses you? And he goes, yeah, James Leslie Bennett. And I said, spy? And he goes, yeah. And I said, why? He goes, because he never was. And I went, what do you mean he never was? He goes, there are secret reports that he never was the spy. It was somebody else. So I said, well, I got to get information, and I got it from various sources. And I went to the main guy who did the investigation, a guy named Starnes, who was head of the security service. And I said to him, I just would start off the interview very calmly, talk to him about the spy service, and he would talk to me about that. And then I said to him, you ever meet James Jesus Angleton? And he looked at me and says, yeah. And I said, who's James Jesus Angleton? He said, well, he was head of the CIA's KGB bureau in Washington. What do you think of him? And he says, well, the guy was kind of crazy. This guy Starnes says, Angleton's kind of crazy. Saw a communist KGB behind every tree that he ever, passed. And I said, uh-huh. And you had dinner with him once, didn't you? And he's looking at me and goes, yeah. I said, what happened at that dinner? He said, well, he told me that Lester B. Pearson, the prime minister, was a KGB mole. And what was your reaction to that? He goes, I just thought the guy was completely insane, crazy, because I used to be the executive assistant to the prime minister, Prime Minister Pearson. And I said, oh, yeah. I'm already taking him down the river. So I said, so then the story went on because I interviewed the head of the CIA at the time, and he told me that Angleton was an absolute alcoholic and complete nutbar. So later I was talking about James Leslie Bennett said to Starnes, so what triggered your investigation into Bennett? He goes, well, the allegation that he was a mole, and this was serious stuff. I mean, a mole for the KGB in the RCMP security service. This is really, you have to investigate. I said, so who told you he was a mole? He says, James Jesus Angleton. And I said, and you believed him? He goes, well, what did you want me to do? I said, did you believe him when he told you that Lester B. Pearson was a mole? And he looked at me and goes, well, I said, did you believe him? You told me he was crazy. Why would you believe somebody that you tell me is crazy when he tells you that the head of investigations for the security service is a mole? And he goes, well, that's because he wasn't. And he looked at me and goes, what? And I said, Leslie James Bennett was never a mole. We prove it because I can tell you who the mole is. He goes, well, you better be careful with libel. I don't have to worry about it. The real mole was Gilles Brunet. And you people had information and undercover information that this guy was in fact the mole. And I also interviewed the KGB colonel who was operating the moles in Canada, who said Bennett was never the mole, but we're so glad we got rid of him because he was a thorn in our side. But Gilles Brunet was the mole. He looks at me and says, yeah, well, how do you know this? And that could be libel, so I'm not commenting. And I said, yeah, you're not commenting. Your people know it, and everyone else knows it. The reason you didn't investigate him was because he was the son of the deputy commissioner of the RCMP. Now, he's completely fried. So I said, so what do you have to say? You know what his response was? Well, that's the spy biz. So they screwed a Canadian, an honest, hardworking person that believed in Canada and the safety and security of Canada, sent him off into exile, lost his family, destroyed his life, and knowing full well for over 20 years that he was never a spy. When the documentary came out, and Starnes was in it and other people, the Solicitor General of Canada flew Bennett back to Canada. They apologized to him in the House of Commons, and they gave him a lot of compensation, money compensation. Bennett cried when he was talking to me and thanking me. But a year later, he died of a heart attack. But at least he didn't die knowing that the Canadian government and the Canadian people thought of him as nothing but a traitor. But it was in that interview with Starnes that I knew I could take him on, because I had all of the information on what they did to try to break Bennett and all of the sleazy stuff they did in trying to show that he was gay at the time, because he said him and his friends like the gay ladies, or they like the gay lifestyle. Well, back in the 50s, gay did not mean being a homosexual. It meant the gay girls. I don't know. I wasn't involved in that kind of stuff in those days. But everything that he said and everything they tried to do was to discredit him as a person, when they knew full well that James Jesus Angleton was a sick alcoholic jackass for the CIA. And there's been much written about him, including the fact that the head of the CIA at the time told me that Angleton was not to be believed about anything. And when the head of the security service in Canada could tell me that a nutbar by the name of James Jesus Angleton said that the Prime Minister of Canada was a KGB mole, that should have been enough to say, we're not going to even listen to this idiot. But it's in listening to what Starnes was saying and other people were saying, even though I had some research, I knew when to come in and when to come out. because I could have sat there and just with one question at a time. It's listening to what they're saying and to be able to come back to it and make the story even a stronger one. Years ago, on one of the Michener Awards that I won had to do with Lang Michener, the law firm of Lang Michener, which was really a big law firm in Canada. And it started off with a very simple investigation that I was doing about an immigration lawyer, business immigration lawyer, who was bringing very, very wealthy Hong Kong businessmen to Canada under a specific kind of program that if you invested $200,000 into a business in Canada, gave Canadians jobs, you can get landed status. This was just a scam from the beginning to the end with this lawyer. He made millions, and he joined the law firm of Lang Michener. They discovered, or one of the lawyers in the firm discovered, that there was a huge multi-million-dollar scam going on. But a number of the lawyers were co-opted by this guy in smuggling of jewelry and other things that were never declared, and also in the kind of activities they were involved in when they went to Hong Kong. Eventually, Pillsmaker, the lawyer, was charged, and the Law Society was aware of the lawyers at that law firm and that they should have done something about it. And I went to the head of discipline in the Law Society of Upper Canada, a guy named Lamech, and started off very calmly. So, because he said, I don't want to discuss the cases, it's before us, and we have to judge. So I said to him, how do you discipline somebody? How do you do the investigation? Because we'll be investigating the decision, which used to be weighty, he said, it was very difficult, it was a lonely job, would be made by me. I said, but then I decided that I'm going to bring in 2 vice chairmen, and the 3 of us would make that weighty decision, so I wouldn't be this lonely person out there. I could always say lonely. I go, okay. And he kept on and on. So I had that. Now, I also knew that lawyers in all of these big firms have friends and buddies, and they drink together, and they go to the winery in the basement of the Law Society. I knew they were part of club. And I knew that the Law Society of Upper Canada was not taking seriously what the other lawyers had done at Lang Michener. So my next question to him was, in Lang Michener, you made a decision, or a decision was made by the discipline committee, you and your 2 vice chairs. And he looked at me, and I knew I had him. So he says, I made that decision myself. That's but you just told me that you had your 2 vice chairs there so that you wouldn't be lonely in the world. How come you made the decision by yourself? And I knew exactly why. And the public who would read the story in the Globe and Mail afterward would know exactly why. Because he's buddies with these people, and several of the people that eventually did get disciplined were friends of his, very close friends of his, because that's part of the club. But it was listening to him set himself up by himself to tell me that he had appointed 2 vice chairs with himself so that it would not be a lonely decision, that it would be a weighted decision by 3 people. And yet he cast them aside so that he could make the decision himself. And that's by listening and knowing what he has said in the beginning and what you know to be the case or the facts. Because, any story that I've ever worked in, I did a lot of research because, for example, taking on a very powerful law firm in Canada, the lawyers at the Globe and Mail, they were just shaking all the time and quaking in their boots for libel and slander. And he said, they're going to come after you, Victor. They're going to come after you with guns blazing. You are messing with the wrong people. And I said, all I'm doing is looking at something, investigating something, and everything that I have down, I can prove, and I could show chapter and verse what had gone on with this one lawyer and then how it went into that law firm, and how it was all about money, and then how it backfired on the law firm, and how everything was being swept under the rug by the Law Society of Upper Canada, its investigations unit, its disciplined people, the whole 9 yards. But it's in, becoming a good journalist is doing your research, because before you do your interviews, before you go into anything and take people on, because I had to take people on in the law firm of Lang Mitchner, I had to take people on very high up in the Law Society of Upper Canada. I had to deal with my editors who were going, oh my God, I hope this is really true. And I said, do you think I want to lose everything that I've earned in my life with a lawsuit from this group? Knowing your information, being good with your information, and then taking it further. But when you're in the interview, you don't give it all away. You set up your interview in a pattern. You set it up where you take it one step at a time, with one question at a time. Let them answer each of the questions, and sometimes just pause for a bit, because that's what I would do. Just yeah, and just be quiet, because then they feel they have to say something more. And it's in the saying something more that sometimes you go, whoa, that was one hell of a statement, and that's exactly what I need to go further with my questions. Oftentimes, I never got to about half of the question, because the interview took a bent that I had not expected, but a much better approach and a much better story than what I had ever anticipated. One of the things that the Lang Mitchner story did was, somebody came up to me and they were walking by me, and they said, I thought they called me a cretin. And I went, what'd you say? And he just went, Chrétien. And I said, Chrétien. What about him? He said, you're a good reporter. Find out. Lang Mitchner, Chrétien. So I started to dig into that. And it turns out that Lang Mitchner had hired Chrétien for a lot of money. And there was a blackmail attempt by that lawyer that was kicked out of the firm. And it was that Chrétien's wife was working for the firm in Ottawa. She got paid a good sum of money. The problem was, she never, ever, once, ever walked into the office and did anything. And I approached Jean Chrétien with that. And I knew Chrétien quite well, being a Montreal bureau chief for the Globe and Mail and whatever. And I contacted him and I said, hey Jean, your wife was working for Lang Mitchner. And he goes, yeah. And I said, so why did you hire your wife to work for Lang Mitchner for you? And he goes, well, Victor, I needed a bilingual secretary. And I said, really? He goes, yeah. I said, you couldn't find a bilingual secretary in probably the most bilingual city in the entire country, called Ottawa? Because I could have given you 50 names, having worked in Ottawa for the Bureau. So he goes, yeah, well, I needed her there. And I said, so how many times did she come in the office? He goes, what are you doing with this? I said, you have been, cited in an email as part of a blackmail scheme to get a lawyer off of something by the name of Pillsmaker. I said, your wife never worked in the office there. And he said, well, you're not going to put that in the paper. And I said, oh, yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm going to do the story. After about 6 or 7 expletive deleteds that he called me, which I've been many times called all kinds of names, he hung up the phone and said he would never speak to me again. And never did. Because he wanted to protect, and I could understand that, his wife. But the reality is, things would come out as how to do the interview, because he would say, I needed a bilingual secretary. It's crock. She's working for me. She's working in the office. Well, Lang Mitchner confirmed for me 100% she never came in the office, ever. So he got this chunk of money and switched it over to her. And c'est la vie. Everything that you do in an interview, you prepare, but everything that you've got to understand is the interview is key. If you want to have an incredible story, or whatever story you're working on, or take it a step further, it's to listen. always listen to what someone is saying, because when you look at your research, you say, wait a minute, that doesn't jibe. And that's when you can take a person on and say, wait a second, I've been doing all of this research, and you said this. In Zundel's case, when I gave him the numbers of people who've been attacked and the number of people who've been killed, and he says, well, this is coming from Jews and lousy reporting. I said, no, it came from the German government. So you throw it right back at him. This is not me making it up, and it's not Jews making it up, and it's not reporters making it up. These are statistics from the German police and the German government about what neo-Nazis are doing and what his friends and associates and people who follow him are doing. And it's because of him and people like him that are being beaten, murdered, having their houses burned down, their apartments burned down, their kids being, beaten on the street because of what he says and what he does. And that this is what we were showing throughout our time in Germany doing that documentary. So it's a lot out there for you to absorb on this, but it's always very simple for me. It's doing a really good amount of research, particularly if you're going to do an investigative story, but even just a general story on COVID or on the vaccines or on price gouging by so many of these companies that suddenly have jacked up the price of food, for example. And everybody's saying, well, it's inflation and it's the supply chain. No, it's the gouge change. Look at it and start to research it, and then you'll be able to say, after someone says to you, well, everything's costing us more, the food's costing us more, the employees are costing us more. And you go, really? So in the first quarter, you earned $1 billion profit. The second quarter, you earned $1.5 billion profit. In the third quarter, you earned another $1 billion profit. Where you don't see gouging in those numbers? You're earning billions of dollars in profit. You haven't given any raises to your employees. The price of food suddenly is going through the roof. The truckers are still getting paid the same. But it's to be able to sit there and say, wait a second, when you say that everything is costing more, the only thing that seems to be going up dramatically, is your profits. But there's very few reporters who are out there challenging this kind of thing. When every quarter when something comes out, you see the profits, you go, wow. And then everything else just went up, but the profits were amazing. I'm sure it wasn't trickle down. It's to buffer their own riches. But any story that you go into, whether it's medical, whether it's environmental, I was an environmental reporter for a number of years. I was a social issues reporter for a number of years, especially in the area of trafficking of women, of the children in the child welfare system. I wouldn't call it the child care system, but the child welfare system, and it would investigate things as to why these kids died in care or why these women are being trafficked. I wrote a book called The Natashas Inside the Global Sex Trade, and subsequently a book called The Johns, and investigating why men who are totally responsible for the rape of millions of women around the world just because they have money in their pocket. And most of these women, the vast majority, are forced into these brothels and onto the streets by gangs. It's not that they wanted to be there. It's not that they said when they were 16 and 17 years old, wow, this is something I really want to do, meet men every night, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 14 of them, and make money. Because much of the money I found in my investigations, oftentimes very dangerous investigations, is that most of the money goes to the pimps and the gangs and the brothel owners. Very little of it goes to the women who are being trafficked into this trade. But every investigation I've done, I get to start at the ground level and work my way up, and then realize, where am I going to do these interviews? How am I going to do these interviews? In the trafficking of women, when I was in Kosovo and Bosnia, and saw the peacekeepers there, Canadian peacekeepers, American, British, French, Italian, German, Spanish, And what were they all doing? They had R&R, rest and recreation. And what were they doing with their rest and recreation? They were going into the brothels, and they were filled. These brothels were filled with 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-old Ukrainians, Moldovans, Russians, Belarusians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Bulgarians, all trafficked in for one reason: to service those troops, to service the peacekeepers who were there to bring peace and tranquility and safety to a war-torn region. And what were they doing in their spare time? Going to these brothels and basically, with money in their pockets, assuaging their conscience, I should say, by giving money to the brothel owner or to the pimp. And now he can say, hey, I paid for it, it was fine. That gave them the right to rape these girls. And they knew these girls were 16 and 17 and 18 and 19 and 20. And when I came up against the head of the UN peacekeeping mission people in New York City at the UN, I went after it to a point where they could not believe the material I had. To try to tell me, this clown tried to tell me that, well, the brothels are there because the Bosnians or the Kosovars were bringing them in for their own use. Tried not to laugh, because these people didn't have a euro or whatever their money was at the time to buy food. And you're telling me that they had money, 200 euros or 150 euros or 75 euros, to go with a Moldovan woman or with a Ukrainian woman or whatever they had trafficked into that area? I went into the brothels and saw with my own eyes all of the Americans and Canadians and French and whatever in there having a great time with their money. And basically what they were doing was raping these girls because they paid to do whatever they want to do. But again, these are investigations, so that when you start with, before you even go out and do little interviews and whatever, you get what you need, and then you go with the information that you have and with the evidence that you have, and go after the people that need to be held accountable. One of the things that I've always liked about journalism that they allowed me, the Globe and Mail and the CBC when I was at the Fifth Estate, or W5 as CTV, was that they allowed me to do the tough stuff, the stuff that a lot of reporters are afraid to do. I don't mind going after bad guys. I don't mind holding bad guys accountable. I go after them, whether they're police, and I've gone after the RCMP on so many issues that they were basically, as far as I was concerned, criminally involved in, and asked the tough questions, to the point that no one in the RCMP would ever speak to me again, because I asked the tough questions about shootings that RCMP were involved in, or in operations, undercover operations that they were involved in that were absolute scams, that they were set up to nail people so that they can have an ego for themselves to say, look what I did, I caught this terrorist, look what I did, I caught this international drug smuggler, which is the case of Ellen Olivier, where these two clowns out in BC who were heroin addicts out there, who were quoted as being, these terrible mujahideen Islamic terrorists, when they were nothing but heroin addicts set up by the RCMP. In the end, you look at everything that they do through your research and say, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture? And you go after that picture and say, listen, this doesn't make sense. And then you go after the various people involved and hold people accountable. To me, there's nothing better in journalism than to be able to do a really solid interview and go after someone and nail them on accountability, and nail them so that people understand that you just robbed these senior citizens of X thousands and millions of dollars with your scam. What'd you do with the money? And one of the things, by the way, I used to see, when you give all this information out, you got to be very careful. And so, did you do this? When I hear them say, when they're interviewing a killer in prison or something, did you kill that person? Yeah. You know why I'm saying yes to you? Because you're so nice, and you asked me nicely. What do you expect the idiot to say? You don't say, did you kill the person? The question really is, police have investigated this, and they say, you're the killer. What's your response to it? And then you bring the evidence. But once you give them the yes and no answer, like when you make it so easy for them to say yes and no, you don't have much of an interview. When you're trying to write it up, I asked him this, he said no. I asked him that, he said no. I asked him this, he said yeah. What kind of an interview is that? It's not really fulfilling for anybody, the reader or the viewer or the listener. You have to ask questions that do not bring out a one syllable, a syllabic answer. What's the word I'm looking for? Just a single word answer. Yes, no. Because you asked the wrong question. It's how you ask the question that's important. You look at all of these senior citizens who've had millions of dollars scammed off of them by your operation. What'd you do with the money? Are you going to pay them back? You know full well that when you look at your operation, it was a pyramid scheme. Where's the money now? You got $10 million out of it. Where's that money? And that's how, you don't say, did you set up this scheme? No. Where are you going to go with that? No. Did you kill that person? No. Yeah, well, all the evidence shows that you did, but, you just let that person off. You have to let that person talk. And the way you do it is that the evidence shows that you did this. Your response. And the guy's going to try to figure, I didn't do it. The evidence shows you did. 100%. Your DNA was there, or the videos are there. It shows it. And you're telling me you didn't do it when everything is there. So tell me, how did you get involved in this thing? And then it's amazing how people will start talking, or in some cases, which has happened to me on more than one occasion, they get up and walk out. But at least you posed the question and they walked out on you because they know that they're stuck. I know the field of journalism is daunting when you have to do really tough interviews, but it's even daunting when you just have to go to Ottawa or to your provincial legislature or to your city hall and ask questions about what they're doing about certain issues that are affecting that area. Like in Vancouver on East Hastings, and with all of the deaths that are involved with the opioids. And and I've been down there and I've done stories on that in the past. But to challenge those people who are in power to do something about it and really go after them and say, so many people have died over the last year of opioid overdoses. What are you doing about it? Do their life, and then, whatever they say, do their lives not matter to you? They were once somebody's kid. And you're saying, well, we're looking into it. What do you mean you're looking into it? This has been going on for 20 years. I could look into it and tell you in one hour what's wrong here and what should be done. Or the housing crisis, or any of those kinds of issues, the environmental issues that are out there, the overfishing issues that are out there. There's so many issues out there for young journalists to get their teeth sunk into and really do incredible interviews that make you feel good as a journalist to get that information out to your reader, to your listener, to your viewer. It's there. It's getting tougher and tougher to get into the field, but young journalists, the world is changing. It's not the same kind of world that I was involved in with, we started off with a pencil and a pen and a notepad, I should say. Tape recorders came in then, and now we have video things, and we can take our cell phones, and they want you to use your cell phone at the same time. The world is changing, even with newspapers closing down and whatever, but there's still this machine out there called social media that is becoming a really important voice for so many issues and so many young journalists to get involved in and make a name for themselves, where people are going to listen and go to you and wonder, what you're up to and what are you going to be doing next. I enjoyed my time as a journalist with 47 years worth of it, and it was for me really good because my editors and the people that I worked for let me go and do what I felt was important, no matter what issue. Most of them social issues, and I'm very passionate about social issues. But I knew very, very early on that the way to get a really good and powerful story is the interview. It's always the interview. If you don't know how to interview, if you sit there and ask a whole bunch of questions at the same time, or you sit there and want to put your intellect and intelligence on the table before the person you're interviewing who's going to fall asleep, or if you spend your time looking for the next question, looking down at your papers, and the person realizes that who's you're talking to or interviewing realizes that you're not interested in them, you're only interested in your question, you're not going to get very much out of it. You're going to have a flat interview that nobody was going to want to read, listen to, or hear, or watch, because you have to be involved in the interview. You have to look at that person all the time and talk to that person and ask the question, listen to what they say, because oftentimes, and this has happened to me a lot of times, the interview suddenly shifts and you realize, wow, did not expect that, and then you go after it and you get a 10 times better story. Because sometimes people say things that they don't mean to or trip over, and that's the story. Because a lot of people are, they're trained by PR professionals, they're trained by their political handlers on how to answer a question. And how to answer a question is a mantra. And I see this all the time in Ottawa, and I see this in the provincial legislatures, and I see this in city halls. These politicians are asked a question, and they don't really answer it. And very few times the reporter doesn't come back and say, wait a second, this is the question I asked you. And the public really would like to know the answer to that. You didn't answer it. You have to be able to have the guts to do that. I don't even think you need guts to do that, but I notice with the sheep on Ottawa, they're on the hill, they're all following the same herd. They're pathetic journalists overall. They don't ask the tough question because they want to be part of the circle, part of the team, part of the political scenery. And that's not your job. Your job is to do a proper interview, to ask the tough questions, to know what you're talking about, and to challenge, to hold people's feet to the fire, to hold people accountable. And in that comes the interview. It always comes back to how you handle yourself in the interview. And that's where you will, in the end, get respect. In my case, sometimes feared. But they know when they're coming to me or I'm going to them, I am going to be objective, but I'm going to be tough. If I ask a question, I generally always expect an answer. And I don't really sit back and listen to somebody obfuscate and don't respond. I go back to the same question. And if I have to go back to it 3 times, and especially if it's on air, guess who looks like a fool? Not me, because I keep going back to the same question. What is it that you're going to do about this issue? You're not giving me an answer. And if they say, well, we're looking into it. What are you looking into? This has been a problem for 100 years or 50 years or 25 years, or you've known about this for 6 months. What have you been doing for 6 months that you knew about it, or a year that you've known about it? And X number of people have died or have suffered because of this, because you did nothing for 6 months or a year. How do you respond to that? And that's how, that's your job, is to be thinking, what is wrong with this picture? And then you go after it. But again, it's really in your research. It's in knowing your subject, knowing your topic, knowing what it is you're going into, and what are the problems with it, what are the issues surrounding it. And once you have that down pat in your head and in your keynotes, your key questions, and always in your key questions, so you have the question here, have a big space which says, shut up and listen, and then ask the next question, because you're going to find out you're never really going to get to that next question, because that interview is going to start taking different ways and different twists and turns, because you were smart enough to listen. And a lot of that's not happening today. A lot of it is not happening. A lot of these reporters are not listening. They're just ready to go off with the next question. And the next question has nothing to do with what the guy just said. And oftentimes you'll see someone say something and they're looking at you, and then you come up with another question and they realize that they weren't even listened to, because they will say enough to actually say, wait a second, wow, that actually happened to you. Tell me more about that. And then you start getting more into a conversation, because conversations are what people want. They don't want you to tell me how smart you are. They want you to get involved with that person and let that person talk. Let that person tell you what it is that's important about what they have to say. And then you can challenge, you can go back and forth, but it becomes a 10 times better story, and it becomes a 10 times better response. So, do any of you have questions you want to ask? Because I can yap and yap and yap, but feel free.
Hello. I have a question. Oh, you can go, Alejandro.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I wanted to ask how, or if you have any techniques, but how are you able to maintain all of the emotions or in place whenever you are interviewing someone that you disagree with or is against your morals?
I have interviewed hundreds of people that I detest, and I know what my job is. I go in there and I'm there to get, the kind of, I'm there to get the information, whether it's a Zundel or whether it's a scam artist or whether it's a killer or whether it's, something that the RCMP have done that is really anathema to me, or Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or any politician where they get involved in something that is scurrilous. I personally am pissed off when I was doing interviews over the trafficking of women or children who died in care in Canada, in the child welfare system. I was inside burning, boiling. I grew up in the child welfare system, so I know what it's like to live in an institution. I know what it's like to be in detention centers and things like that, and what happens to kids. This was back in the late 50s and throughout the 60s. And I got through it, but I'm one of the few people who actually got through it, because I had a focus and a vision that took me out of that world and into a world where I can challenge those kind of people who have caused the abuses and have caused the emotional upheaval in innocent kids and in women who could not defend themselves. When I go out around the world, when my book, The Natasha's, came out, I went all over the world talking. And people, because now I could speak, not as a journalist, but as an author of this book. And I blasted people. I took on, men. I took on the soldiers. I took on all kinds of people. And I blasted away at them, because then I could have my anger and my rage come out. People are saying, well, you're like an evangelical minister. I said, no, I'm not. I'm not there as a religious anything. I don't make any judgments on people, but I know bastards when I see them, and I call them out. But as a journalist, when you sit back and you're doing the interview, you've got to be calm and you've got to be smart about what you're doing, because if you suddenly take the camera and start screaming and going crazy, you've just lost. You're the loser. And the guy who pissed you off and elicited this emotion out of you, he wins. I've walked out of places and saying, now I really need a shower, or I need a couple of shots of vodka or something just to calm me down, because, and I've had cameramen and soundmen and producers come up and say, I don't know how you did get up and punch the guy right in the head. And I said, you don't know how many times I actually wanted to do that, and And I've walked out of interviews later on, and the guy would come up to me and say, "So what do you think?" I said, "Well, you're a piece of shit, but you know that every time you look in the mirror. I'm sure your kids know that, and I'm sure your wife knows that, and I'm sure your mother and father know that they brought up a piece of shit." But that's my opinion, but not want to get into the story. But it's to keep calm, keep cool, keep collected, and keep objective as much as you can keep objective, and you'll get the story. You'll let them dig the hole for themselves. Don't dig a hole in and jump in with them, because nobody wins in the end. Anybody else? Yeah.
My question was about weaknesses. You were talking about that earlier. I was just wondering, how do you identify the weakness of the people you interview, and how do you find Zundels? And is there another example of you exploiting the weakness of an interviewee that got you the answer that you wanted?
Yeah, again, it's in how you prepare for a subject. You can, when you're looking at some of these bad guys, a lot of them have egos, or they think they're tough. Bullies. I've dealt with bullies all my life, whether I was in the boys' homes or as a kid, and then in the detention centers that I was in, and I understand bullies, and I know how to get a reaction out of them. But when just before you go into interviews, you know that if you know your subject and you know where the weakness is in what they're saying, that's how you get them. You can trip them up, and once you've tripped them up, they start to sputter and go all over the place. I've interviewed people who've killed, and literally had them falling all over themselves. I've interviewed politicians where I've actually destroyed them. They've lost their cabinet positions. Just by listening to them and saying, "Wait a second, you just told me this, but the reality is that. Which is it?" I don't have to say you're a damn liar. He just got caught. And, a lot of people who want to hide things can often trip over themselves. But again, it comes into listening or pausing for a bit and letting them feel that they have to say something else. And then they say something else, and then it keeps going. I know it's a way of reading people. It's not, and again, it's when you're sitting down and watching that person and thinking to yourself, he's just handing me a bag of BS, and how to take that on, but always keeping calm and not flipping out on the guy saying, "Hey, you're nothing but a liar." Although in your mind you're saying, "What a liar." Taking on a guy like Starnes, who was the head of the security service for the RCMP back in the day when they got James Leslie Bennett and accused him of everything, to be able to get him, because he thought he was really something else, and he's coming up against a young guy who, what does he know? What does he know? But I had all the information I wanted, because I'd already interviewed the head of the CIA at the time, Colby, and I knew about James Jesus Angleton. I knew a lot of this stuff. I had an RCMP insider tell me a whole bunch of stuff. So I let the guy hang himself by telling me that James Jesus Angleton had once told him over dinner that the Prime Minister of Canada, Lester B. Pearson, was a Soviet mole. And this guy, when I said, "What do you think at that point?" That guy was crazy. He's insane. I go, "What a maniac." I got up from the table and I left. I said, "He's an idiot." My next question is, so who led you to investigate Bennett? And he knew he was screwed. He knew it from his face. And he said, "Well, we got word." "Who'd you get word from?" "James Jesus Angleton." He goes, "Yeah." "That's why would you listen to him?" "Well, because he was the head of, that part of the CIA." "Yeah, but why would you listen to him?" "I just told you." "No, but you just told me that he was crazy, insane, a whack job, an alcoholic. Why would you listen to a whack job and destroy a Canadian who was an outstanding Canadian and destroy that person's life?" Now, it's whether you're dealing with people all the time who have different agendas, and it's to understand what the agenda is. If it's people who have been beating on people or robbing people or scamming people or being abusive to people or not doing their job and it results in people being seriously hurt or injured or killed, then you know you can get them because they're going to try to hide whatever it is that they messed up with. I've gone after police officers, detectives who have done remarkably terrible jobs at getting people convicted of murders that they never committed because they were sold on the fact, because they were right and they didn't bother looking in other corners for things. And yet I would look and say, wait a second, that guy could never have done that, or that woman could never have done that because it doesn't fit. And I actually could find who it was who did it. And then you go after the detectives. I'm telling you, going after homicide detectives and telling them you just got the wrong guy and getting that guy out of prison. Even in Olivier's case as well, getting him out of a Thai prison after he was sentenced to death and then commuted to 99 years in prison over a setup by the RCMP. And when I went to Thailand, I went with this point of view. They got one of the biggest importers of heroin ever into this country. And then when I met the guy in prison and he told me the story, all I could think about is, does he think I'm freaking nuts to believe this bullshit? And I came back to Canada and started to investigate because something on the airplane coming back said, wait a second. This just has this bizarre ring of truth to it. And yet when I interviewed RCMP about it, I got the circle. I got obfuscation. I got all kinds of things. And I said, holy shit, I got to dig and keep digging and keep digging. And it turned out that everything that Olivier had said to me about how he was set up and how the RCMP used him and abused him and threatened him was all true. Every bit of it. And, it was proven. I did a documentary later on, and there was a movie that just came out about a year ago called Target Number One, which was about my investigation into the Olivier case. And Josh Hartnett played the reporter Victor Malarek in it. And it's kind of cool to have a nice-looking guy play me. But you every interview that you will ever go into, it's to try to, especially if it's accountability, you have to try to see where you can get under that person's skin, or how you can trip him up, or how you can get him or her. And that takes a lot of skill, and it takes a lot of understanding of people. But again, sometimes it's not the skill, it's the question. And the question, when you first start, I always come back to it. You listen, and eventually that person, with your other questions and listening and coming in and out, can trip that person up. Because oftentimes they'll say something at the beginning, and in the middle, they say something else that doesn't make any sense, but you've already listened. But if you haven't listened, and I've seen this with people at the Fifth Estate in W5, it just throws me off. I go, holy crap, man, you should have gone after him right there because you just had him. You had him. But I know why you didn't have him, because you didn't listen. You missed it. And you missed it because you didn't. You were waiting for your next question, and he got away with it. So, not an easy job doing these kind of interviews, but it's something you'll learn as you go on. And it's in real life too. It's in whether you're in a job or any kind of job, people are asking you something or you're asking them. It's to listen to what the responses are, and not to be ready to go at the next thing, because everything's different. You never know what's going to come out of somebody's mouth. But as a journalist, if you've got your evidence in your pocket or on your notebook, or your research, which is solid and based on facts, you can get a person. And they oftentimes, a lot of times, they think that journalists are stupid. And boy, do they meet some of the tough ones and realize that should never have spoken to him. When I spoke to the head of the police union in Toronto, and I began my interview, as I said, people look at you as a bully and a thug. What's your response to that? And then the interview, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to show this guy what he was. And 2 years later, he was retiring from that job. And there was a big interview in the Toronto Star. And the writer said, when you look at your whole career as a police officer, as the head of the union later on, what do you most regret? And he said, ever speaking to Victor Malarek. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool because I got him. I got him. And that interview, by the way, got me a Michener Award because of who he is and what he did. And to prove what he did when he was a cop and to prove what he did was when he was with the union. And holy mackerel, I mean, he could not believe the research I had. And he couldn't, it was the way, I was in a car with him and we were going through different areas. I said, yeah, it's this tough area. I mean, he must have had some pretty rough times. And I started speaking to him like a streetsy kind of guy. And he just went into it. And the conversation between him and I was like pretty streetsy. And later on, my producer, they took the tape out of the car and he says, what was he like? I said, monosyllabic, really terrible interview. We can't use it. 3 a.m, my phone rings. He goes, holy shit, man. How did you get him to say these things? And I said, because you don't know the street. This guy's the street. I said, I grew up that way and I know how to play it. But it's knowing the kinds of person that you're going up against. Politicians, for me, in most cases, are pretty easy prey because they obfuscate and you can get them. You can get them with persistence and you can get them by simply asking a very straightforward question. And if they don't answer it, you go back at it. And then you can really, after a while, you get to see what that person's all about, which is usually pretty shallow. Anybody else? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you if you go through a process while choosing what story to follow.
Yeah, I do actually. I've had basically things handed to me on a platter because when I came from Montreal Star to the Globe and Mail in '76, I had a reputation. I'd broken some heavy stories about kids who had committed suicide in detention centers in Montreal. And again, there was a movie made on that as well, and how the system hid it. And they came after me because I broke the stories about these 3 kids who hanged themselves in a detention center in the cells at Christmas time. And the government hid it, everybody hid it, but some kids came out of it who happened to know who I was through their brothers, through their older siblings. I had been in that detention center in the cells. And when I started to investigate it, I realized that these 3 kids had never committed any crime. They were put there during Christmas time because the social services had no place to put them and they had Christmas off. So as a result, they hanged themselves with their skate laces. When I went after the government for it and they denied it ever happened, my files were released to the Montreal Star to discredit me. And the Star was ready to pull the stories. Instead of pulling the stories, another reporter came in and said, because they were trying to verify what I did, other much older reporters, he said, oh, so Malarek's correct, but it's only 1. And then a half an hour later, they came back, oh, it's 2. And then a half an hour after that, no, it's 3. So they never pulled the story. It was right on the banner. And they kept saying, when I tried to get the story into the Montreal Star, they kept saying, we don't do suicides. We don't do suicides. We don't do suicides. And I said, look, it's not about the suicide. It's about what leads that kid to the suicide. What was it that got that kid to kill themselves? That's the issue here. So, I used that against the cabinet minister at the time, Claude Castonguay, the social services minister of Quebec. I said, why is it that you people hid this from the public? And he looked at me, and it was not about the social workers dumping the kids there at Christmas time. His excuse was this: well, they're Catholic. What? He said, they're Catholic. What does that got to do with anything? And he said, well, in the church, if you kill yourself, you cannot go in the church to have a service, and you cannot go in sanctified ground. So I looked at him and I went, oh, wow, that's so nice of you. you cared so much about them when they were dead, but you didn't care about them when they were alive. But it was this kind of story that led me, and other stories I did for the Montreal Star to get to the Globe and Mail, where they said, what do you want to do? And I got to follow the kinds of stories that I wanted to do, the kinds of issues that I wanted to get involved in. And whether later on when the CBC called me and asked me to work on Fifth Estate or CTV with the W5, they knew that I have to be, you can't put reins on me. You got to let me find my stuff. Like, I know that, I had to do 14, 15 documentaries a year for W5 or Fifth Estate, that some of it will just come to me from my researchers, but I always got to do 3, 4, or 5 really good investigations, which were mine. And they never said no to me on mine. And other stuff I would say, I'm not really interested. Or they would say to me, look, everybody looks at you as a guy who never smiles. You look pissed off all the time. Everybody's afraid of you. You got to do some funny stuff sometimes. So they had these air races that were done by, what's that drink that you drink that gives you a high? Like, does anybody know? It's like a coffee type drink. Anybody know? They used to have these airplane races.
You talking about like Monster or Rockstar or something like that?
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about the drink they sponsor.
Yeah.
It's like a coffee type drink, but it's always being advertised. But anyway, they had these air races where the airplanes were going through all these courses. And they said, well, why don't you do a story on that? I said, so I did. I went. So at one point, because I was being kind of silly with the pilot, he said, well, why don't you go up on a plane? I'm telling you, later on when I was in the editing suite, all my producer and my cameraman, all I heard was, holy shit, holy crap, oh my God. The thing was taking dives to 3Gs, 4Gs, and I'm thinking, I'm going to freaking die. And later on, the pilot comes down and he says, I asked you how you were feeling, and you said, okay, so I took you 1G, 2Gs, 3Gs, 4Gs, 5Gs. And he said, then I thought, I'm not going to take it to 6Gs. And I went, I said, I just said, yeah, I'm okay. I could have been okay after the first backward flip, and that was enough for me. But, at least people saw that I had a sense of humor. So I wasn't always this really serious guy. Once a year, they would try to get me to do something lighthearted, because, I sort of look at life as, or still do, but not as much, in a very serious light. But because I broke so many stories at the Montreal Star and then starting for the Globe and Mail, they let me alone. And they said, just leave him alone, let him do his thing. And I was one of those few reporters who was lucky enough to be able to dig wherever I did, whether it was environment, whether it was social services, whether it was in politics, whether it was in legal issues or scams or murders or police improprieties or whatever, their investigations were. They let me do it because I proved myself. And because I was basically known as a lone wolf. Just leave Malarek alone. He does his thing. He goes in his world. But you don't get there right away. I was a police reporter. I worked on the FLQ crisis. And I started to cut my teeth on different things. And at that point, they said, this guy is good enough to be left alone. And they did. They left me alone. One of the things that I found very interesting is these reporters who got pissed off at me when I would be sent to Ottawa. And they would come back and say, well, I knew about that. They would get a report and they would read the press release on the report. I would read the report and find gems in the things and break one story after the other. Canadian Security Intelligence Service, they through their review committee, would release a report. And it's always couched in things, but I could read through what was there and then go after various people and do these interviews and find stuff out that I'd have 4, 5, or 6 out of those reports, front page stories in the Globe and Mail, having reporters screaming from the bureau in Ottawa, What's Malarek doing? That's not his business. And, my managing editor would say, well, it certainly wasn't yours, was it? Because you read the press release. It's to go beyond that. When the Auditor General comes out with their report, some of the stuff in these things is blockbuster. But these people go to the press release because they want to get it out there quickly. And they miss it. I look for what's wrong with this picture, or is there something wrong with this picture? Why is this report framed that way when there's something odd that catches me? One of the things, and I wrote a book called Gut Instinct, which was on my investigations years and years ago. And it's something that always comes to me when I'm looking at it going, something doesn't sit right with me on this. Doesn't smell right. There's something wrong. And if I get that feeling, I know it's not because I ate something and I have gas or something. It's because something is wrong. And I start to look and I find it. And one of the various editors that I worked with and producers I worked with all knew that I could look at something and say, this is a story. There's something really strange going on here, and then to go after it. And again, so then you do that research and you know who to interview, who are going to be the weak links that you have to break somehow, and how to do it and do it. I know there was a guy named Rollater, Dr. Stupid, who headed the brain injury clinic at Hamilton Hospital and Chinook Hospital and the University of McMaster. He had features written about him in newspapers. He had him framed on his freaking wall, all this stuff, Everybody's, the second coming of Jesus Christ. There was something odd about the character. And eventually, a person walked to one journalist after the other, even at the Fifth Estate, was a mother. And she said, my kid was in the brain injury clinic. She's 9 years old. And Rollater was very rough with him and yelling at him and everything. You better eat your food. And forced the kid to eat his food. The kid threw up. He forced him to eat the vomit. And I went, oh. Says, yeah, I don't know how I'm going to do that with a 9-year-old kid who has a brain injury. And he says, yeah, well, I've heard of other stories. And then I went to interview this girl who, on her high school graduation, her boyfriend got drunk and smashed a car and she got brain injured. She says her life was destroyed. She urinates and defecates just at the word Rollater. Something's wrong where somebody would do that. And then I spoke to a male nurse who told me incredible stories about Rollater. And I kept saying, there's something wrong with this guy. He supposedly has a PhD. He's teaching at the psychiatric department of McMaster University. He's on the Chinook Medical Group and whatever. $10 million have come his way from the Premier of Ontario at the time, Harris. Photographs of him and everything. Video of this kid that was helped, an amazing video. And I said, I tried to find out. So he had a PhD from Ohio State University. I would assume that the Hamilton Hospital, the Chinook, and the university and everything would check it out. He didn't have a PhD. He had a P.Ed, gym teacher. He did not have any of these degrees that he said he did. So I got a hold of a male nurse who told me all of these stories about how he tortures kids, literally tortures them. And I said, well, it's going to be pretty hard to do the story, but if you want to come on camera, he goes, I can't. Then he said to me as he's leaving, yeah, he's such an ego, he videotapes the torture sessions. And I went, what? And I said, well, it'd be amazing if I can get a videotape. And he said to me, well, that's doctor-patient privilege, can't happen. I said, well, you know what? Things happen all the time that come in the mail in brown paper envelopes. And it did, came in a brown paper envelope. And there he was torturing this kid, yelling at him, having people pick him up by the back of his arms and, literally, you fucking little bastard, you little prick, you little son of a bitch, you fucking call me a fucking prick. I'm Dr. Rolliter. I'm Dr. Rolliter. You know what I could do to you, you little bastard? I could put needles in you and put you to sleep every day for 20 years. You'll never know anything. You'll be numb, you little bastard. You swear to me. Pick him up again from the back of his arms and torturing this guy who's got brain injury, young guy. I'm looking at this video thinking, you son of a bitch, man, I want you in front of me. Then I looked again, I went, holy shit, that's the same kid that they brought out for the premiere as a success case. And went, holy mackerel. I went after Rolliter in an interview where it was not a nice interview, but I mean, I was very polite, but the question was just one question after the other, and he realized that this guy is going to be in big trouble when this hits the air. And when it hit the air, he was gone. He went to another country and was never seen again. But the newspapers who wrote these grandiose features of this SOB, grandiose, never retracted anything, never reported on what I did or anything like that. They just let it go. They bought this guy hook, line, and sinker without not even looking at who he was all about. And again, in the interview with him, it was like water torture with me because I would just hit him with one, hit him with another. So, they have a 9-year-old kid in front of you, Dr. Rolliter, and he's not eating his potatoes. So you yell at him to eat his potatoes, and he throws up, and you made him eat his vomit. Oh, I don't remember that. And so the guy swore at you. You grab him by the back of the arms. You heave him up in the air. You do all kinds of things to him. You're swearing at him. You're right in his face like this and everything. Oh, There's another guy that swore at you, and you put him on one of those speeding things, they're walkers, and you kept turning up the speed till he fell and he scraped all his face and all his side. And now he's starting to sweat. And I go, what about this girl who, every time she hears your name, she defecates and urinates? What does that say about you as a therapist? What are you all about? That's when he got up. And he went to his office, and I could hear, this guy's a psycho. I could hear him say, how dare he? I'm Dr. Rolliter. I'm Dr. Rolliter. He can't talk to me. I'm Dr. Rolliter. He can't talk to me like that. And I went, Twilight Zone. So, people have come to me with stories, and they'd say they already spoke to 5 or 6 or 7 other reporters, and the reporters just basically fluffed them off. They went, well, what am I supposed to do? And one woman came to me one time, and she said to me, everybody I went to, including reporters at the Fifth Estate and W5, and they said, the police are saying, and the coroner has said, and the ballistics people have said, my son killed himself. And I said, yeah. What am I supposed to do with that? And she goes, well, he didn't. I know my son. And I said, I know you probably don't want to believe that your son killed himself because he's your son. She goes, he didn't kill himself. And she threw the pictures at me. 8x10 glossies of the kid dead on the floor with a rifle and blood all over the place, his brain splattered. And I'm looking at this thing going, oh, God, this is what I need to look at. And then I looked again, and I looked again, and I went, shit, he didn't kill himself. And she said, what? And I said, he didn't kill himself. She goes, what do you mean? I said, there's no way he could have done that with that rifle. His shotgun. It's the double-barrel shotgun. And it's still in his hand. I said, how does he take a shotgun and get it here and blow it? And by the way, the burn marks are here. It's just not possible. And I went to other ballistics experts with the pictures and proved 100% that he didn't kill himself. But so many reporters didn't take the time to look at anything. They simply bought the fact that the coroner got it right, and the Ontario ballistics people got it right, and homicide got it right in Hamilton. They didn't. They all got it wrong. And I proved it 100% because I listened to what the woman was saying. And then when she put those pictures down, I went, holy crap, holy crap. I looked at the evidence, and I realized that there was something wrong with that picture. And I knew there's no way guy's lying on the floor with a shotgun in his hand that he managed to somehow, I don't know, he didn't have 11-foot arms. It could not happen. And it was proven by the RCMP ballistics people that this guy was murdered. And I went after a murderer. Then I went after the Crown. Then I went after the detectives. Then I went after the coroner and said, you let a murderer off. It's all about listening. It's all about looking. It's all about, sometimes the story sounds crazy, but sometimes the most crazy story has a hell of a lot of truth to it. As in Alain Olivier, as in the two guys, the husband and wife, who were convicted of planting kettle bombs in the BC legislature. You ever see that documentary I did on that? They were totally set up by the RCMP. And yet everybody was buying the story that, these people were mujahideen terrorists. There were two people who were heroin addicts who together didn't know how to tie their shoes. And when you look at the undercover footage, which I got a hold of, not the edited version given to the court, but all of the footage, all of the emails, and realize that they entrapped these people, that they were never capable of doing what the RCMP said they did. And the RCMP committed crimes that they should have been charged with. And one of the crimes they should have been charged with, giving these two people plastic explosives, C4 explosives, to put into these kettle bombs. That is 100% against the law. And yet, you think any journalists in Vancouver or Victoria have gone after that and said to the RCMP, why have these people not been charged? Nope. Because everybody wants to be a friend. I'm not there. Look, a lot of cops like me, but when you do a story about their department or something, they suddenly don't like you. But I've done positive stories on cops, and I've done negative stories on the Vancouver police, for example. I was banned for years, and then I did this story, and they went, wow, let's open the door back to them. The RCMP in all of BC will never speak to me because I've proven on 3 occasions that their officers were involved in shooting deaths, 4 occasions that they were involved in shooting deaths, that when you look at it, they lied. And the deaths were totally avoidable. And you had to wonder, why did they do this? They absolutely, unequivocally lied. And I proved it with the forensic evidence. It didn't have to interview anybody, just look at the forensics. Got the forensic evidence and went, this story that the cops have said is bullshit. That was almost like an execution. In fact, in one, it actually looked like an execution. But, the RCMP come against me and say, how dare you? Because you have the blue wall, or in the case of the RCMP, the burgundy wall, or whatever color the red wall. And that's the way it is. Investigative journalism, or any kind of journalism, could be really rewarding. Whether you're writing a business for a business magazine, or whether you're writing in entertainment, or whatever. Because there's so many interesting entertainment stories, but the interviews are so loosey-goosey, silly. Like sometimes you look at it and go, you don't get anything from these people. They're just stupid stuff. But lives of some of these people, like Keanu Reeves, the one who did the Matrix stuff and whatever. His life is really fascinating. As being abandoned by a father, having a streetsy kind of life. That's the fascinating part of this guy, and yet they center in on silliness. There's a lot of people who have incredible stories to tell, and yet, when you talk to some of these actors and actresses later, they say they hate most entertainment journalists because it's all a joke to them. It's all fun and stupid, and they have incredible stories to tell. And you look at all of the women now that are saying what had happened to them to try to get a role in movies. I mean, this stuff was known for years, but nobody said anything or did anything. And a lot of these women's lives have been destroyed internally, what they had to do to get ahead. But a lot of these reporters don't want to rock the boat because they'll never get another chance by that film company to interview anybody on another film, because they're more afraid of losing their their ticket to getting into these places than doing a really honest day's work, or doing an honest story, or doing an honest investigation into what is really happening in various industries. And, again, it's pretty sad. It's a sad commentary on journalists, but,
Victor, I think some of the students have to get going, and so maybe now is a good time to wrap things up. I want to thank you. You've been very generous with your time. To say you've had an incredible career is an understatement. I'm still lobbying you to write another book about your career, and I think what you said today proves I might be right, that you need to write that book along with the other books that you're writing now and publishing now. One of the major points you've made is the importance of listening in an interview. And for those of us who've been able to listen to you today, we can say it's great to listen to you. Thank you, Victor Malarek.
Listen, by the way, there's a book that I just wrote. It's called Wheat Shaft, and it's in ebooks, so it's really inexpensive in ebooks. But it talks about a reporter who's a younger reporter, which basically kind of based on me, but he goes into a modern day famine. But in 1982-83, I went to the famine in Africa, in Ethiopia. And a lot of the stuff that I saw and the kinds of things that were going on, I sort of incorporated it into this book. But you get to see this reporter developing into an investigative reporter. So if any of you, want to see it on an ebook, it's another as well, but the ebook is cheap. It's called Wheat Shaft, and I think you'll enjoy it because you'll enjoy the character. The character is really interesting. So
yeah, and that reminds me of what you wrote about Ethiopia in one of your biographies, and I when I was reading that in your book, I was just you've talked a lot today about exposing people who've done wrong, but I also wonder how you handled the suffering that you saw, how you handle the interviews in Ethiopia, the refugee camp, when you're interviewing somebody who is, has been wronged and suffering, how you handle that personally.
It's hard to decelerate from this stuff. Many of the things that I've seen, or especially if it involves the death of children or the death of people who, murdered or whatever. Sometimes I just look and say, it's important to tell this story for this reason. And I try to tell the story and, take a deep breath afterwards and say, at least that person had a voice, or that issue got aired one way or the other. In Wheat Shaft, the reporter comes back from Eritrea and Tigray, and his girlfriend asks him, and he does. He's trying to deal with it because he's never seen anything like this and how horrific it is. But I've been in 7 war zones. My first one being in 1970 in Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded, and it's horrible. This was the first time I've seen people blown up and people's legs blown off and arms blown off and heads blown off. I was, in Ukraine for the war in the eastern part of Ukraine, and seeing all the soldiers coming back with the legs blown off and faces destroyed. And, I saw this 9-year-old kid who stepped on a mine, and, I stepped outside and cried for the kid because you see him and what a life. He's got 2 legs gone and an arm gone. And, but we brought him to Canada. I did a documentary on bringing him to Canada, and he was, they outfitted him with prosthesis and whatever, and he's back in Ukraine. But, he'll never be the same. But you're looking at this and you're thinking, God, what a lousy freaking world we live in sometimes. But you have to just take a deep breath and go forward with another, with another and another. Sometimes my friends are amazed that I haven't had a nervous breakdown, but, vodka's good.
Yeah, it's happened to some reporters. They've got PTSD. They stress disorders from the same things that you've seen.
Yeah. But I started seeing a lot of crap when I was very young, and I think that probably steeled me onto how to deal with it when I was getting older.
Mm.
And I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it, and I steered a course on that. And it's for a reason. Everything I think I've done is for a reason.